Open your refrigerator right now. There's a good chance you'll find a carton of eggs sitting there. Smooth, uniform, all the same size, all resting in the same little cardboard pockets. And almost certainly, every single one of them came from the exact same animal, a chicken. It's such a normal sight that most of us never stop to question it. But chickens aren't the only animals that lay eggs people eat. Ducks do too. So do geese, quail, and even ostriches. And out of all of them, there's one egg that might genuinely be the best one you're not eating. The one that quietly disappeared from the American diet, even though nothing about it ever stopped being good. The duck egg. Let's look at what you're missing, because the numbers aren't subtle. A duck egg is nearly 50% larger than a standard chicken egg. It carries more protein, more healthy fat, more vitamin B12, and more iron. The yolk takes up a noticeably bigger share of the egg, which is exactly why professional bakers who switch to duck eggs almost never go back. One duck egg in a cake batter can effectively do the work of an egg and a half from a chicken. Chefs who work with them regularly talk about a richer mouthfeel and a deeper color in the finished dish. The kind of small difference that's hard to describe until you've actually tasted it side by side. Here's a detail almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one. Some people who have a genuine allergic reaction to chicken eggs can eat duck eggs without any issue at all. The specific proteins responsible for triggering most chicken egg allergies simply aren't built the same way inside a duck egg. For a household managing a food allergy, that's not just trivia. It's the difference between a food category being permanently off limits and quietly reopening. So here's the obvious question. If duck eggs are bigger, richer, more nutrient-dense, and in some cases safer for allergy sufferers, why does a country of over 340 million people basically act like they don't exist? Why can you walk into almost any grocery store in America and find 6 or 7 kinds of chicken eggs, but not a single duck egg on the shelf? The easy answer is supply. Ducks are simply harder and more expensive to farm at scale. A laying hen eats a cheap feed mix around 16% protein and starts laying by roughly 5 months old. A duck typically needs richer feed, more calcium for shell strength, and reaches full production later. Multiply that gap across a commercial operation with tens of thousands of birds, and the math clearly favors chickens. But that explanation has a hole in it. One duck breed was specifically engineered to break every one of those rules. It's called the Khaki Campbell, developed in England in the early 1900s, purely for egg output. A well-managed flock can lay over 300 eggs a year per duck, essentially matching a commercial hen. So the idea that ducks simply can't keep up doesn't hold. A breed capable of matching commercial hens has existed for over 100 years. Something else pushed duck eggs out of the picture. And that something wasn't really about agriculture. It was about fear. Rewind to the years right after World War II. Duck eggs were still a normal part of the American food landscape. Not as dominant as chicken eggs, but far from rare. You'd find them at local markets, in bakeries, and in home kitchens, especially in rural and immigrant communities where duck keeping had always been common. Then, almost overnight, that changed. A string of Salmonella outbreaks got traced back to duck eggs specifically. The actual scientific connection was thin at best. Salmonella can contaminate any bird's eggs under unsanitary conditions, chickens included. But ducks tend to lay in wetter, muddier environments, and their shells are naturally more porous, which made contamination easier and made ducks an easy target to blame. Newspapers ran with it, health officials issued warnings, and in the public imagination, duck egg quietly became shorthand for the risky one. By the time the panic faded, the shelf space had already been permanently claimed by chicken eggs. And once a supply chain reroutes itself around one product, there's very little reason for it to ever reroute back. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, though. The Salmonella scare explains why duck eggs disappeared in the mid-20th century. It doesn't explain why they never came back once refrigeration and modern food safety standards made the original risk almost irrelevant. Today's chicken eggs go through automated washing, careful grading, and refrigerated cold chain shipping. a system that has essentially eliminated the contamination risk that scared people away from duck eggs 70 years ago. A modern duck farm operating under those same standards should be just as safe. We don't have to guess either. In countries like China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, duck eggs are eaten daily, boiled, cured into salted yolks, turned into century eggs, and sold right next to chicken eggs, with no health stigma attached at all. Nobody there treats a duck egg as the dangerous option. It's just breakfast, just another item on the shelf, chosen or skipped based on taste and price rather than fear. So think about that timeline. The original fear had a real shelf life of maybe a decade, but the absence it created has now lasted 3/4 of a century. That gap is the real story. At a certain point, this stops being a food safety story and becomes a habit story. A default nobody consciously chose to keep, but nobody bothered to question either. Grocery chains don't guess at what might sell. They stock what's already selling. Duck eggs got locked out, not because people rejected them, but because almost nobody today has ever really been given the chance to. There's a cultural layer sitting on top of this too. Right around the same decades duck eggs were disappearing from shelves, cartoon ducks were becoming some of the most recognizable characters on the planet. Donald Duck, Daffy Duck, Darkwing Duck, Howard the Duck, an entire lineup with personalities and story arcs. Chickens mostly stayed background livestock in picture books. Ducks got cast as characters people grew up loving. And it's genuinely a little harder to walk past a carton labeled duck eggs without some part of your brain filing it next to a cartoon. There's a second, more practical reason underneath the cultural one, and it's purely mechanical. Duck eggs have thicker shells and tougher membranes, which actually gives them a longer shelf life unwashed. But that same shell creates a problem for modern processing facilities, because every washer, candler, and carton sealer in a plant is calibrated to the exact size and shell strength of a standard chicken egg. Retooling an entire production line for a product that's a sliver of total demand simply isn't something producers have found worthwhile. So duck eggs stayed frozen almost exactly where the 1950s left them. Small farms, farmers markets, and the occasional specialty grocer. Which brings up a strange thought. Somewhere in America right now, there's a kid who has never once considered that an egg could come from anything other than a chicken. Not because chicken eggs are objectively better, not because duck eggs are actually dangerous, but because a health scare from before their grandparents were born quietly rerouted an entire national food system, and nobody ever bothered to route it back. The eggs are still out there, exactly as good as they've always been. The ducks that lay them haven't changed. The only thing standing between you and a bigger, richer breakfast is a supply chain still operating off a decision made 70 years ago, for reasons that stopped being valid decades before you were born. And duck eggs aren't even a particularly unique case. They're just one visible example of a much larger pattern that shows up everywhere once you start looking. Take a close look at almost anything you consider completely normal. And there's usually a moment buried in the past where one person made a call, a farmer, a regulator, a panicked headline writer. And that single call quietly hardened into a permanent boundary for an entire country. Nobody ever voted on it. Nobody circled back to reconsider it once the original reasoning stopped applying. It just calcified into how things are. And every generation inherited that boundary without ever being told it was drawn by hand. So the next time you crack open a carton of chicken eggs without a second thought, it's worth remembering that the version of breakfast you grew up with was never actually inevitable. It was one outcome among several just as viable, decided decades ago by a health scare that barely held up under scrutiny, and locked in permanently by a supply chain that never bothered to double back and check whether its own assumptions still made sense.